In the Middle Ages, the blacksmith was one of the most important figures in village and town life. His work shaped not only the tools used in everyday farming and building, but also the weapons that determined survival in times of war. Without the blacksmith, fields could not be tilled, houses could not be repaired, and armies could not fight. He stood at the center of medieval technology, turning raw metal into objects of strength and utility. Weapons in particular gave the blacksmith a special role. The medieval world was one of constant conflict, whether small disputes between neighbors, raids by bandits, or wars between rival lords and kingdoms. Knights and soldiers depended on strong swords, axes, and spears. Even peasants sometimes carried simple weapons for defense. These did not appear by chance. Each one was carefully forged, hammered, and hardened by the steady work of the blacksmith at his forge. The blacksmith was more than just a worker of iron. He was part craftsman, part engineer, and part problem solver. Every weapon he produced needed to balance strength and flexibility. A sword that bent too easily was useless, and a blade that was too brittle might shatter in battle. The blacksmith had to know how to work with fire, how to shape metal under the hammer, and how to give each weapon the qualities it needed to survive combat. His knowledge was practical, learned through years of practice and passed down from master to apprentice. In medieval society, the blacksmith's forge was often a gathering place. The sound of hammer on anvil rang out across the village, a rhythm of daily life that reminded people that work was being done. Farmers came with tools to be repaired. Lords sent for weapons to be made or sharpened. Travelers stopped to see if nails, horseshoes, or knives were available. The blacksmith's role was tied to the needs of everyone, from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest noble. Weapons themselves carried meaning beyond their physical use. For knights, a sword was not just a blade, it was a symbol of honor and status. For soldiers, a spear or axe meant the difference between life and death. For lords, having well-forged weapons for their men showed strength and authority. Behind all of these symbols stood the blacksmith, who rarely entered battle but whose work determined the outcome of many fights. This combination of practicality and importance gave the blacksmith a respected position in medieval communities. He was not always wealthy, for his work was demanding and the materials costly, but he was necessary. The survival of villages in peace and the strength of armies in war both relied on his skill. His forge was the quiet heart of medieval craftsmanship, where heat, hammer, and iron came together to create the weapons that shaped the age. The blacksmith's workshop was the center of his world. In a small village, it might be a modest wooden shed with a roof of thatch or timber, while in a larger town, it could be a sturdier stone building. However simple or large, it was built to contain fire, smoke, noise, and constant labor. The forge was both workplace and symbol, a place where raw earth in the form of iron was transformed into tools and weapons. At the heart of the workshop stood the forge itself. This was the furnace, built of stone or clay, where charcoal burned hot enough to soften iron. Blacksmiths did not use modern fuels like coal or gas. Instead, they relied on charcoal, made from wood burned slowly in pits or kilns, to produce fuel that gave a hotter, more consistent fire. Without charcoal, iron could not be heated to the glowing red or even yellow state needed for forging. Maintaining the fire was a skill in itself. Too little air, and the flames died down. Too much air, and the fire burned away the fuel too quickly. Beside the forge was the anvil, perhaps the most recognizable tool of the blacksmith. Usually made of solid iron, it provided the surface on which heated metal was hammered into shape. The anvil was more than just a flat block. Its horn, curves, and edges allowed the smith to bend, flatten, and shape the work in many different ways. Every strike of the hammer against metal echoed across the workshop, carrying the steady rhythm of labor. Villagers often knew that the blacksmith was at work simply by hearing the ringing of the anvil from a distance. To keep the fire burning hot, the blacksmith used bellows. These large leather pumps forced air into the forge, increasing the heat. In some workshops, a single pair of bellows was worked by hand or foot. In larger forges, 2 people might operate them, or they could even be connected to a simple water wheel in wealthier towns. The bellows hissed and groaned as they forced air through the coals, giving the forge its life. The blacksmith's tools were simple but essential. Hammers of different sizes shaped the iron. Large, heavy hammers for drawing out and flattening, smaller ones for detail and precision. Tongs held the hot metal, gripping it firmly so the smith could turn and move it without burning himself. Chisels cut into the iron, while punches made holes. Files and grindstones finished the edges, smoothing and sharpening blades into their final form. These tools wore out with use and had to be replaced, often by the smith himself. In this way, he was both maker of weapons and maker of the very tools used to create them. The atmosphere of the workshop was harsh. The forge gave off intense heat, filling the small space with warmth even in the cold of winter. Smoke and sparks filled the air, leaving the walls blackened with soot. The constant pounding of the hammer was deafening to those not used to it. For the blacksmith, however, this was the sound of his craft, the rhythm of his trade. His body was hardened by years of work, his hands thick and calloused, his arms strong from lifting hammers again and again. Despite its harshness, the workshop was also a place of order. Tools were arranged where they were needed. The forge was carefully maintained. Water troughs stood ready for quenching hot metal. Apprentices learned not only the craft but the discipline of keeping the workshop prepared for long hours of labor. The space reflected the smith's experience, built for efficiency in a trade where mistakes could ruin hours of work or even cause injury. The blacksmith's workshop was never quiet. Even when the hammer rested, there was the sound of the fire crackling, the bellows wheezing, and the hiss of hot metal plunged into water. It was a place of heat, noise, and transformation. From morning until evening, the smith worked within this space, surrounded by the tools and fire that defined his life. It was here that ordinary lumps of iron were reborn as swords, spears, knives, and countless other weapons that would find their way into the hands of soldiers, knights, and villagers alike. The blacksmith's work depended on one material above all others: iron. Without iron, there could be no plows for farming, no nails for building, and no swords for battle. Iron was the backbone of medieval technology, but it was not easy to obtain. It had to be mined from the earth, smelted in furnaces, and then shaped at the forge. Every weapon, every tool, began its life as rough ore dug out of the ground. In medieval Europe, iron was mined in many regions. Some mines were shallow pits dug into hillsides, while others were deeper shafts supported by wooden beams. Iron ore looked like ordinary rock, but was heavy and often reddish in color. It had to be broken into pieces and transported to furnaces, where it was smelted. Smelting was the process of heating the ore with charcoal until the iron separated from the rock. This produced a spongy mass called a bloom, which still contained impurities. The bloom was then hammered and reheated to remove slag and create usable wrought iron. Wrought iron was the most common form available to blacksmiths. It was relatively soft compared to modern steel, which made it easy to shape and bend. For everyday items like nails, hinges, or simple tools, wrought iron was sufficient. But for weapons, something stronger was needed. A sword or spear made only of soft iron could bend in combat, losing its edge or shape. Soldiers required metal that could both cut and endure, and this is where steel came into the picture. Steel was created by adding carbon to iron. This was not done by mixing powders or liquids, as in modern factories, but through a process of heating iron in contact with charcoal. Over time, carbon from the charcoal seeped into the iron, hardening it. The result was a metal that was stronger, tougher, and more durable. Steel was harder to produce and more expensive, but it was highly prized for weapons. A sword of good steel could keep its edge longer, resist bending, and deliver a sharper cut. Blacksmiths did not always work with pure steel. Instead, they often combined layers of iron and steel in the same weapon. A sword, for example, might have a soft iron core for flexibility and a steel edge for sharpness. The smith achieved this by forging and folding the metals together, heating them until they were red hot, and then hammering them into a single piece. This technique required great skill, as the layers had to bond properly without splitting. When done correctly, it produced a weapon that was both resilient and deadly. Working with iron and steel was not an exact science. Medieval blacksmiths did not have modern knowledge of chemistry or precise measurements of carbon content. Instead, they relied on experience, observation, and tradition. A skilled smith could judge the quality of metal by its color in the fire, the sound it made under the hammer, and the way it behaved when quenched. These were practical skills, passed down from master to apprentice, refined through years of trial and error. The blacksmith's relationship with iron and steel was also shaped by availability. In some regions, good iron ore was plentiful, and blacksmiths could work with relative ease. In others, supplies were scarce, and every scrap of metal was valuable. Weapons were sometimes reforged from older ones, melted down, and reshaped to save material. Nails, horseshoes, and broken tools could be collected and returned to the forge for reuse. Metal was too precious to waste. The importance of steel meant that the best weapons were often reserved for the wealthy. Knights and lords could afford swords of carefully forged steel, while common soldiers might carry simpler iron weapons. This difference in quality reflected the social order of the time. Just as lords wore fine armor and peasants wore simple clothing, so too did their weapons show the mark of wealth. Despite these differences, the work of turning iron into steel represented the height of medieval blacksmithing. It was here that skill and material met. The blacksmith's knowledge of fire, hammer, and metal determined whether a weapon would serve its master well or fail at a crucial moment. Every bar of iron carried potential, but only through the smith's craft could it become a weapon worthy of battle. In the dim light of the workshop, with the fire glowing and the hammer ringing against the anvil, the transformation of iron into steel was both practical and almost mysterious. From rough stone taken from the earth, the blacksmith created the tools of survival and the weapons of war. The mastery of iron and steel stood at the center of medieval life, silent but essential, hidden behind the noise of the forge yet present in every field, home, and battlefield. Once the blacksmith had iron or steel ready to work, the true craft of forging began. This was the long, repetitive, but essential process of turning raw metal into a finished weapon. Every stage mattered, and each step had to be done carefully. A mistake early in the process could ruin days of labor. For the medieval blacksmith, forging was both art and routine, a blend of patience, strength, and long experience. The process always began with heating the iron in the forge. Bars of iron were placed directly into the bed of charcoal, where the fire, fanned by the bellows, glowed white-hot. The blacksmith watched closely, judging the heat not with modern thermometers but with his eyes. The color of the metal told him when it was ready. A dull red glow meant the iron was still too cold. A bright orange or yellow indicated it was soft enough to shape. If the metal overheated and sparked, it could be ruined, becoming brittle and weak. Timing was everything. Once the iron reached the right heat, the smith pulled it from the fire with long tongs and placed it on the anvil. Here the rhythm of hammering began. With steady strikes, he stretched, flattened, and shaped the glowing bar. The hammer rang out with each blow, sending sparks flying into the dim air of the workshop. Large hammers were used first to draw out the rough shape, while smaller hammers refined the details. The blacksmith worked quickly, because the iron cooled with every passing moment. When it grew too hard to shape, it had to be returned to the forge and heated again. This cycle of heating and hammering repeated over and over, sometimes dozens of times, before the weapon began to take form. For swords and more complex weapons, the blacksmith often used a method known as folding. He would hammer the metal flat, fold it over, and hammer it again, repeating this process many times. Folding combined layers of iron and steel, distributing impurities and strengthening the metal. Each fold refined the blade, making it tougher and more flexible. Though the smith might not have explained it in scientific terms, centuries of practice had shown that folding produced a better weapon. The finished blade carried within it the marks of this hidden labor, its strength born from countless folds and strikes of the hammer. Once the weapon was roughly shaped, the blacksmith refined its form. A sword was drawn into a long, tapering blade. A spearhead was narrowed to a sharp point, with a socket hammered out to fit onto a wooden shaft. An axe head was widened into a curved edge, sometimes with a hole punched for the handle. Daggers, knives, and arrowheads were shaped in their own ways, each according to its purpose. The variety of weapons meant that no 2 days at the forge were exactly the same, but the rhythm of heating, hammering, and shaping remained constant. After shaping came one of the most critical steps: quenching. The heated weapon was plunged into water or oil to cool it rapidly. This hardened the steel, giving it strength. The hiss of hot iron meeting cold water filled the workshop, accompanied by a burst of steam. Quenching was dangerous. If done too quickly, the weapon could crack or warp. If done unevenly, one part of the blade might be too hard while another remained too soft. The blacksmith relied on his judgment, guiding the process through experience alone. A hardened blade, however, was also brittle. To prevent it from shattering in combat, the smith performed tempering. This meant reheating the weapon to a lower temperature and then allowing it to cool slowly. Tempering reduced brittleness while keeping strength, giving the blade the balance it needed to survive the shock of battle. This delicate balance, not too hard, not too soft, was the true test of a blacksmith's skill. A well-tempered weapon could be trusted in combat. A poorly tempered one might fail at the worst moment. Once hardened and tempered, the weapon was finished with grinding and sharpening. The blacksmith used grindstones to smooth the edges, removing hammer marks and shaping the blade into a fine cutting surface. This was slow, careful work, but it gave the weapon its final form. A sword might take on a sharp edge along its length. A spearhead was ground into a lethal point. Even an axe or dagger received careful attention, for the sharpness of the edge could determine whether the weapon was effective or useless. The forging process was long and exhausting. Creating a simple knife might take a day. Forging a sword could take weeks. Each stage demanded strength, focus, and patience. The fire had to be fed constantly, the bellows pumped without pause, the hammer lifted again and again. The blacksmith worked in heat and noise, surrounded by smoke, sparks, and the constant weight of his tools. Yet through this labor, raw metal was transformed into weapons that would be carried into fields, towns, and battlefields across the medieval world. For those outside the workshop, the process seemed mysterious. A lump of iron went into the forge, glowing with heat, and out of it came a gleaming sword or axe. To the villagers who heard the anvils ringing, it was a kind of alchemy, a transformation of earth into steel, of fire and hammer into strength and sharpness. But for the blacksmith, it was simply his craft, learned through long years of apprenticeship, repeated endlessly, and carried out with the steady rhythm of experience. In this way, the forging process stood at the center of medieval weapon making. It was slow, methodical, and demanding, but it gave the world the weapons that defined its wars and defended its people. Each sword, spear, or axe carried within it the story of countless hours at the forge. Each blow of the hammer recorded in the hidden strength of the steel. The medieval blacksmith did not produce just one kind of weapon. His forge was the source of many different arms, each suited to a particular use in war, hunting, or daily defense. Some were simple and utilitarian, meant for common soldiers or villagers. Others were complex and finely crafted, designed for knights or lords who valued both function and appearance. The range of weapons forged in medieval workshops reflects both the diversity of medieval warfare and the adaptability of the blacksmith's craft. The most iconic of these weapons was the sword. Swords came in many forms, from short, one-handed blades to long, two-handed greatswords. Early medieval swords were often broad and straight, with double edges, suited for slashing in combat. Later designs became longer and narrower, better for thrusting through armor. Forging a sword was among the most challenging tasks for a blacksmith. It required careful control of heat, hammering, and tempering to produce a blade that was sharp yet flexible, strong yet not brittle. A good sword might take weeks to make, and the finest examples became prized possessions, handed down through generations. Not all weapons were as costly as swords. Many blacksmiths produced spears, which were far more common. A spear required less material, usually just a sharpened iron head fitted onto a wooden shaft, and could be made more quickly. Spearheads were forged in many shapes, narrow and pointed for piercing armor, broad and leaf-shaped for cutting, or even barbed for hunting. Spears were used by peasants, soldiers, and knights alike. They could be thrown as missiles or wielded in close combat. The simplicity of the spear made it one of the most widespread weapons of the medieval world. Another weapon forged in the blacksmith shop was the axe. Like the spear, axes came in many varieties. Some were single-bladed, designed for chopping. Others had two edges, allowing for multiple strikes. Axes could be small, used in one hand, or large, requiring both hands to wield. Unlike swords, axes could also serve everyday purposes, such as cutting wood, which made them versatile. For blacksmiths, forging an axe head meant shaping a strong, heavy blade that could be mounted securely on a handle. Soldiers valued them for their power in battle, and many villages kept them as both tools and weapons. The blacksmith also made maces and hammers, blunt weapons designed to crush armor. These were simpler to forge than swords, since they did not require a sharp edge, but they demanded durability. A mace head had to withstand repeated impacts without breaking, and its weight had to be balanced for effective use. Blacksmiths sometimes added flanges or spikes to mace heads, increasing their ability to damage armor. These weapons became more common as plate armor spread in the later Middle Ages, when sharp blades were less effective against heavily armored knights. For archers, the blacksmith produced arrowheads. These were small but numerous. Each arrow required a sharp iron point, shaped according to its purpose. Some were narrow bodkins, designed to pierce armor. Others were broader, meant to cause wider wounds. Forging arrowheads was repetitive work, but armies required thousands of them, and a blacksmith could spend days producing points for a lord's archers. Though individually simple, together they represented one of the most significant demands placed on the forge. Daggers and knives were another essential product. Unlike swords, which were often limited to wealthier warriors, daggers were carried by almost everyone. They were small, versatile, and useful for both daily tasks and self-defense. A blacksmith might forge a dagger for a knight, complete with a decorated hilt, or a plain knife for a farmer, suitable for cutting food, rope, or cloth. In battle, daggers served as backup weapons, used when longer arms were lost or broken. Their small size made them easier and faster to produce, ensuring they were widely available across all classes. In addition to these main weapons, blacksmiths also created specialized items. Halberds, combining spear points with axe blades, became popular in some regions. Polearms of various kinds were designed to give infantry reach against mounted knights. Even crossbow bolts, like arrows, needed iron tips forged in large numbers. Each of these weapons required adjustments in design and technique, but all relied on the same core skills of heating, hammering, and shaping iron. What is striking is the range of work that passed through a blacksmith's hands. In the same week, he might repair a plow, shoe a horse, and forge spearheads for a local militia. His forge did not specialize in a single weapon, but responded to the needs of his community and his lord. Yet when it came to weapons, each type carried its own challenges. The blacksmith had to know how to balance weight, sharpen edges, and create shapes suited to combat. A poorly made weapon could bend, break, or fail, with fatal consequences for the warrior who relied on it. This variety also meant that not all weapons were equal in prestige. A finely forged sword could bring fame to its maker and pride to its owner. A set of arrowheads, while essential, was less glamorous, even though they could decide the outcome of a battle. The blacksmith's craft covered both ends of this spectrum, from humble tools of survival to symbols of status and power. Through these different weapons, the blacksmith's work touched every level of medieval life. From the knight riding into battle with a gleaming sword, to the peasant defending his village with a spear, to the archer firing a storm of iron-tipped arrows, all relied on the steady labor of the smith at his forge. The weapons of the Middle Ages were as varied as the battles they were used in, but behind each one was the same process of heat, hammer, and craft that defined the blacksmith's trade. Forging weapons was not something that could be learned quickly. It was a craft that demanded years of training, endless practice, and a deep familiarity with fire, metal, and tools. A medieval blacksmith's skill was not written in books or measured by certificates. It was passed from master to apprentice, hammered into memory one strike at a time, until the movements became second nature. To become a blacksmith, a boy usually entered apprenticeship in his early teens. He might live with the master, working not only at the forge, but also in the household, doing chores and learning discipline. In the beginning, his tasks were simple: pumping the bellows, carrying charcoal, fetching water, and holding tools. These were not glamorous duties, but they were vital. By watching closely, the apprentice learned how the fire was managed, how metal changed color with heat, and how the master's hammer fell in rhythm. Years might pass before he was allowed to strike the hot iron himself. Only after long training could an apprentice become a journeyman, capable of working on his own but not yet a master. Journeymen traveled, working in different forges, seeing new techniques and proving their ability. Finally, after many more years, some achieved the status of master blacksmith, opening their own workshop and training apprentices in turn. This system ensured that knowledge was preserved and spread across generations, but it also meant that true mastery was rare. A master blacksmith was respected because his skill was the result of decades of experience. The time required to forge a weapon depended greatly on what was being made. A simple knife could be hammered and sharpened in a day, provided the materials were ready. Arrowheads, though small, were usually made in batches, each taking only minutes once the smith had found his rhythm, but thousands might be required, filling weeks of steady labor. A spearhead might take longer, needing careful shaping of both point and socket. A sword, however, was another matter entirely. Forging a sword was among the most difficult tasks a blacksmith could attempt. From start to finish, it could take several weeks of work. The blade had to be shaped, folded, hardened, and tempered. The hilt, guard, and pommel had to be crafted separately and then fitted. The balance of the sword mattered as much as its sharpness. A poorly balanced blade would be clumsy in the hand, no matter how strong its edge. All of this demanded patience, precision, and countless hours at the forge. Not every smith could make a sword of high quality. Many villages had blacksmiths who produced tools, nails, horseshoes, and simple weapons, but only some specialized in sword making. These swordsmiths, often working in towns or under the patronage of lords, gained reputations that stretched far beyond their workshops. A sword made by a known master could be recognized for its quality, sometimes even marked with a maker's symbol. Such weapons were prized possessions, symbols of status as well as tools of war. The difference between ordinary work and masterwork was often invisible to untrained eyes. To a farmer, a spearhead was a spearhead, whether it was plain or finely made. But to a knight, the difference between a common blade and a master-forged sword could mean victory or defeat in battle. The master blacksmith's skill lay not only in shaping the metal, but in knowing how to bring out its hidden potential. He could judge the heat of the fire by color alone, sense the strength of the steel by the sound of hammer on anvil, and predict how a blade would behave long before it was finished. The blacksmith's daily labor was also a measure of time. He rose early to light the forge, often before sunrise, and worked until the light faded. The forge consumed vast amounts of charcoal, which had to be prepared or purchased. Bellows required constant effort to keep the fire hot. Every strike of the hammer was tiring, and hundreds of strikes were needed for even a small weapon. The physical strain was enormous, and the work left its mark on the smith's body. Thick hands, broad shoulders, and lungs filled with smoke. For all this effort, the rewards were not always great. Many blacksmiths lived modestly, earning enough to survive but not enough to grow rich. Payment might come in coins, but just as often it came in grain, meat, or other goods. A sword for a lord might bring higher reward, but everyday work, nails, tools, horseshoes, kept the forge running. Weapons were part of the trade, but not always the main source of income. Still, the reputation of skill mattered. A blacksmith known for strong blades and reliable weapons gained respect in his community. Soldiers trusted his work, farmers relied on his repairs, and lords valued his service. In a world where survival often depended on the strength of a single weapon, the blacksmith's skill was not just admired, it was essential. Skill and time defined the blacksmith's life. Apprenticeship stretched over years, forging a sword took weeks, and the daily rhythm of heating, hammering, and quenching filled every hour of daylight. It was a life measured not in calendars, but in cycles of fire, metal, and labor. And through this long process, the blacksmith gave shape to the weapons that armed the medieval world. When we think of medieval warfare, we often picture knights on horseback, soldiers with spears, and archers loosing arrows into the air. But behind every battle was the blacksmith, whose forge quietly supplied the tools of war. He did not ride into combat, yet his work was present on every battlefield. Without him, armies could not be armed, and lords could not defend their lands. The blacksmith's role in warfare began long before a battle was fought. Local lords relied on their smiths to equip soldiers with weapons. For levies of peasants, this might mean simple spears, axes, or knives. These were quicker to make and required less material. For knights and professional soldiers, the demand was for higher quality swords, maces, and lances. Each type of weapon had to be forged, fitted, and prepared well in advance. When a lord called his men to war, the blacksmith's work determined whether they marched out armed or poorly equipped. In times of conflict, blacksmiths often worked long hours, keeping their forges hot from dawn until nightfall. Armies required not only weapons, but also repairs to armor, horseshoes for cavalry mounts, and countless small fittings, nails, buckles, hinges, that held equipment together. A campaign could not proceed without these supplies. The forge became as important as the granary, both ensuring that men were ready for battle. Once fighting began, blacksmiths played another vital role, repairing damaged weapons. Blades were nicked, bent, or broken in combat. Axes lost their edges, spearheads snapped, and armor was dented by blows. Soldiers returned from the battlefield with gear that needed to be restored quickly. The blacksmith reheated bent blades, reforged broken edges, and hammered dents out of helmets. Sometimes entire weapons had to be melted down and reforged, the old metal given new life in a different form. In this way, the blacksmith extended the usefulness of every piece of iron, ensuring that nothing was wasted. Blacksmiths also contributed to the making and maintenance of armor. While specialized armorers existed in larger towns, many blacksmiths produced simpler protective gear: iron helmets, chain links for mail, or plates for shields. Chainmail, in particular, required thousands of small iron rings, each shaped, linked, and riveted. This was tedious work, but it provided crucial protection. Even if a village smith did not make full suits of armor, he often produced or repaired smaller pieces that made a difference in battle. The blacksmith's work was not only for soldiers, but also for their horses. Cavalry was the core of medieval armies, and horses needed constant care. A blacksmith provided iron horseshoes, shaped individually to fit each hoof. Without shoes, horses wore down their hooves quickly, especially on long marches. Shoeing was routine, but in war it became urgent, as armies could not move without their mounts. In this sense, the blacksmith armed not only men but also animals. Some blacksmiths traveled with armies, setting up portable forges near camps. These were smaller than village workshops, but allowed essential repairs on campaign. A traveling smith might be called upon to fix broken armor, replace lost weapons, or shoe dozens of horses in a single day. His presence in the camp was as important as that of cooks or medics, for an army without functioning weapons was useless. Warfare also influenced the development of weapons. As armor improved, weapons had to adapt. Heavier swords, spiked maces, and warhammers emerged to counter stronger defenses. Blacksmiths adjusted their techniques to meet these new demands. When mail armor was common, blades were sharpened to cut between rings. When plate armor spread, blunt weapons became more effective, and smiths forged accordingly. The evolution of medieval warfare was mirrored by the work done at the forge. The blacksmith rarely saw the battles his weapons were used in. He remained in his workshop, hearing only stories of victory or defeat. Yet his role was undeniable. The outcome of a battle often depended not only on the bravery of soldiers or the strategy of commanders, but also on the strength of the iron in their hands. A sword that held its edge, a spear that did not break, or a helmet that deflected a blow could decide a man's fate. The blacksmith shaped those outcomes long before the first clash of arms. In times of peace, his work for war continued quietly. Lords demanded stores of weapons to be kept ready. Castles needed supplies of arrowheads and spare blades. Training required weapons that could be used and replaced. The blacksmith's forge never rested entirely, for the shadow of conflict was always near in the medieval world. In this way, the blacksmith was both distant from war and deeply involved in it. He did not charge on the battlefield, yet he armed those who did. His hammer blows, echoing in the workshop, were as much a part of war as the clash of steel in combat. Soldiers depended on his unseen labor, and lords depended on his steady hand at the forge. Without him, medieval warfare would have been impossible. The blacksmith's importance in medieval life went far beyond the weapons he forged. His forge was a cornerstone of the local economy, and his place in society was shaped by both his skills and the constant demand for his work. Every community, no matter how small, needed a blacksmith. Without him, daily life would quickly grind to a halt. In villages, the blacksmith's forge was often located near the center, close to where people gathered, worked, and traded. The sound of hammering and the sight of smoke rising from the chimney were familiar parts of village life. People came to the smith for all manner of needs: a farmer with a broken plowshare, a shepherd needing new shears, a knight requiring his sword sharpened, or a householder wanting nails for repairs. The blacksmith's forge was a place of constant traffic, tying him directly to the rhythm of community life. Payment for the blacksmith's services varied. In wealthier towns, he might be paid in coin, especially for specialized work like swords or armor. But in rural villages, payment was often made in kind. A farmer might offer sacks of grain, a side of pork, or bundles of wool in exchange for repaired tools. A shepherd might pay in cheese or milk. Sometimes the blacksmith received labor in return, with neighbors helping him gather wood for charcoal or mend his workshop. In this way, the smith's livelihood was woven into the barter economy of the Middle Ages. Despite the essential nature of his work, the blacksmith was rarely rich. The forge consumed enormous amounts of charcoal, which had to be made from timber or bought from colliers. Iron itself was expensive, and not every village had easy access to good supplies. A blacksmith's income often went back into fuel and raw materials, leaving him with modest means. Still, his position was stable. While farmers might suffer from poor harvests, the smith always had work, for tools and weapons wore out in good years and bad alike. Socially, the blacksmith occupied a respected position. His work was dangerous and demanding, requiring skill that few possessed. Villagers relied on him for survival, lords depended on him for war, and travelers sought him out for repairs. This respect was often balanced with a certain distance. The blacksmith worked with fire and iron, elements that seemed mysterious to those unfamiliar with the forge. His ability to transform rough metal into sharp blades or sturdy tools gave him an air of power. In folklore, blacksmiths were sometimes seen as figures with special knowledge, straddling the line between craftsman and magician. The craft of blacksmithing was not only a personal skill, but also a tradition passed down through apprenticeships. Young boys were bound to masters for years, learning through slow practice. They began by watching, then by tending the fire, pumping the bellows, and carrying tools. Only after proving themselves trustworthy were they allowed to strike hot iron under supervision. Over time, they learned the subtle details of the trade: how to judge the heat of metal by its color, how to strike with rhythm instead of force, and how to temper a blade so that it was strong but not brittle. These apprenticeships ensured that the knowledge of the craft continued from one generation to the next. In towns, blacksmiths sometimes formed guilds, associations that regulated the trade. Guilds set standards for quality, controlled who could practice the craft, and protected members from unfair competition. They also trained apprentices, organized festivals, and sometimes provided support for widows or injured smiths. Belonging to a guild gave the blacksmith social standing and protection, though guild membership was more common in cities than in rural villages. The blacksmith's work extended into religious and social life as well. Churches required iron for bells, hinges, and locks. Monasteries needed tools for farming and construction. Fairs and markets relied on the smith for nails, rings, and fittings. His work touched every part of life, from the most humble chores to the grandest buildings. When villagers gathered for festivals or feasts, it was often the blacksmith who had provided the cooking pots, the knives, or the iron supports for roasting spits. Because of this constant connection to everyday needs, the blacksmith became a figure that people trusted. He might serve as a witness in disputes, his word carrying weight because of his respected status. He might also be seen as a mediator, helping to settle quarrels among neighbors. His forge, always open and always busy, was a natural place for news and gossip to spread, making him not just a craftsman but a central figure in village communication. In the broader medieval economy, the blacksmith's work supported agriculture, construction, and warfare. Every tool in a farmer's hand, every iron fitting in a cart, every nail in a house, and every blade in an army passed through a forge. His work tied together the practical needs of peasants and the military demands of lords. In this sense, the blacksmith was a quiet but essential bridge between classes, serving both rich and poor alike. The economic and social role of the blacksmith, therefore, was more than just making weapons. He was the community's craftsman, a supplier of essential goods, a respected tradesman, and a teacher of apprentices. His forge was a hub of labor, trade, and tradition. In a world where survival depended on cooperation, the blacksmith's work ensured that tools remained sharp, weapons stayed strong, and the community itself could endure. Although blacksmiths were respected for their skills and relied upon by everyone from peasants to lords, their work was never easy. The forge demanded constant labor, and the life of a smith was filled with challenges. These challenges came not only from the physical strain of the work, but also from the limitations of the materials, the tools available, and the broader conditions of medieval society. One of the most constant difficulties was the scarcity of good materials. Iron was expensive to produce and transport. Not every region had rich iron deposits, and those that did often had to ship the ore or the finished blooms over long distances. A village smith might depend on supplies brought in by merchants, which meant paying high prices. When iron was scarce, blacksmiths recycled everything they could. Old weapons were reforged into new ones. Broken tools were melted down for their iron. Even nails were pulled from ruined houses and bent back into shape at the forge. Nothing was wasted because every scrap of metal had value. Another limitation was the quality of the iron and steel itself. Medieval smelting methods were not precise. The carbon content of steel varied widely, and impurities were difficult to remove completely. Some iron was too soft for strong weapons, while some steel was brittle and prone to cracking. Blacksmiths relied on their experience to judge which bars were usable and how to combine them for the best results. But there were limits to what they could achieve. Not every sword came out perfectly balanced, and not every spearhead was flawless. The lack of uniformity was simply part of the reality of medieval metallurgy. The tools of the trade also placed limits on what blacksmiths could do. Their forges were fueled by charcoal, which burned hot but unevenly. The bellows provided bursts of air but required constant attention. Anvils, hammers, and tongs were durable but simple. Without precision instruments or modern machines, every piece of work depended on the smith's hands and eyes. He judged temperature by color, not by exact measurement. He relied on rhythm and experience instead of mechanical aids. This made the work highly skilled, but also meant that mistakes could not always be corrected. The physical demands of the job were relentless. Working a forge required strength and endurance. The hammer was lifted and swung hundreds, even thousands of times in a single day. The bellows needed pumping, the fire needed tending, and the heavy iron needed moving. The forge itself was always hot, even in the depths of winter. In summer, the heat could become nearly unbearable. Burns from sparks, blisters from tools, and smoke-filled lungs were common. Over years, the body of a blacksmith bore the marks of his trade. Strong arms, broad shoulders, but also stiff joints, damaged hearing from constant hammering, and scars from accidents. There were also dangers in the process itself. Quenching hot metal in water or oil produced bursts of steam that could scald skin. If the metal cracked or shattered, fragments could fly into the air. Handling animals for shoeing carried its own risks. A kick from a horse could maim or kill. Even a simple slip of the hammer could injure hands or feet. In an age without advanced medicine, such injuries could have lasting consequences. Economically, blacksmiths faced the challenge of constant expenses. Charcoal consumed vast amounts of wood, which had to be cut, prepared, or purchased. Iron had to be bought at high prices, often controlled by merchants. The blacksmith's income might be steady, but it was balanced by steady costs. Many lived modestly, never becoming wealthy despite the importance of their craft. Only those who gained the patronage of lords or worked in prosperous towns had the chance to rise above a modest living. Socially, the blacksmith could also face tensions. His work was respected but sometimes viewed with suspicion. The ability to transform raw metal into sharp blades and powerful tools seemed mysterious to ordinary villagers. In folklore, blacksmiths were sometimes associated with fire, magic, or even darker powers. Stories told of smiths who bargained with spirits, or whose forges glowed with unnatural light. While these were tales, they reflected the mixture of respect and unease that surrounded the craft. The demands of lords and armies added another kind of challenge: pressure and obligation. A village smith might be required to make weapons for his lord's soldiers, sometimes without fair pay. In wartime, he could be forced to labor day and night to supply arrowheads, spear tips, or swords. Failure to meet these demands was not an option, for lords held authority that could not be ignored. This constant pressure added to the already heavy workload. Finally, blacksmiths faced the limits of time and human endurance. The forge could not run endlessly without rest. Charcoal had to be replenished, tools repaired, and the smith himself needed food and sleep. Yet the demand for his work was constant. Farmers needed tools repaired at harvest. Soldiers needed weapons before campaigns. Lords demanded armor maintained at short notice. The blacksmith's life was one of continual labor, with little opportunity to pause. Despite these hardships, blacksmiths endured. They worked within the limits of their tools and materials, recycling what they could, refining their techniques, and relying on skill where technology could not help. Their challenges were great, but their role was too important for their work to stop. They carried on through shortages, through exhaustion, and through risk, providing the weapons and tools without which medieval life could not function. When we step back and look at the medieval world as a whole, the blacksmith emerges as one of its most essential figures. His forge was small compared to a castle, his tools humble compared to the treasures of kings, but his work touched every corner of society. From the quiet village to the bustling town, from the smallest farm to the grandest battlefield, the labor of the blacksmith was always present, holding the fabric of daily life together. Weapons were the most visible sign of his craft. Swords, spears, axes, and arrowheads shaped the wars of the Middle Ages. Knights depended on blades of steel, soldiers relied on spears, and archers carried iron-tipped arrows by the thousands. Behind every battle, unseen but vital, stood the blacksmith who had forged those weapons with fire and hammer. Without him, lords could not field armies, castles could not be defended, and kingdoms could not survive conflict. But the blacksmith's role was not limited to war. His work was equally important in times of peace. Farmers depended on his plowshares, hoes, and sickles to grow their crops. Carpenters needed his nails, saws, and chisels to build houses and barns. Shepherds came to him for shears and simple knives. Even the church relied on him for iron fittings, bells, and locks. In every part of medieval life, from the field to the workshop to the chapel, the blacksmith's work was quietly present. His forge was also a place of community connection. Villagers gathered there not only for repairs, but also for conversation, news, and exchange. The ringing of the hammer was part of the soundscape of daily life, familiar and constant. To hear the forge was to know that the work of the community continued. To see the glow of the fire was to be reminded that the village was not defenseless, for weapons could be made and tools repaired. The blacksmith's craft also carried a symbolic weight. The ability to transform raw iron into sharp blades or sturdy tools seemed more than just physical labor. To many, it represented a kind of mastery over nature, turning the earth stone into objects of strength and purpose. In folklore and legend, blacksmiths often held a special place. They were seen as keepers of secret knowledge, men who understood fire and metal in ways that others could not. Some stories even cast them as figures of magic, blurring the line between craftsman and sorcerer. Yet in reality, the blacksmith's life was not glamorous. It was a life of hard labor, steady routine, and modest reward. He was rarely wealthy, rarely celebrated, and often overlooked in the grand stories of kings, knights, and battles. But his importance was undeniable. Without him, the grand stories themselves could not have happened, for the heroes of legend still needed swords in their hands, armor on their bodies, and horses shod for war. The legacy of medieval blacksmiths lasted far beyond their own time. The techniques they refined, heating, hammering, folding, quenching, and tempering, laid the foundation for later metallurgy. Their apprentices carried their skills forward, generation after generation. Even as new tools, new fuels, and new machines emerged, the basic principles of working iron and steel remained the same. In many ways, the craft of the blacksmith bridged the gap between ancient hand forging and the industrial processes that would later shape the modern world. When we think of medieval history, we often picture castles, knights, battles, and great cathedrals. But all of these depended, in quiet and unseen ways, on the forge. The blacksmith's hammer rang behind the scenes of history, each strike shaping not only a piece of metal, but the life of the society around it. His work armed armies, fed farmers, and held villages together. In the bigger picture, the blacksmith was not simply a tradesman. He was a foundation of medieval survival. His craft supported war and peace alike. His forge linked the smallest cottage to the largest kingdom. His labor turned raw earth into tools and weapons that sustained entire communities. Though his name may not be recorded in chronicles, his work was etched into the iron and steel that defined the age. The blacksmith's story, then, is the story of the Middle Ages itself, a story of endurance, of quiet strength, of ordinary labor supporting extraordinary events. While kings planned wars and knights sought glory, the blacksmith worked steadily at his forge, turning fire and metal into the tools of survival. His place was humble, but his contribution was vast. Without him, the medieval world could not have endured. The first light of dawn creeps over the quiet village, a pale, hesitant gold that spills across the thatched roofs and the dew-kissed cobblestones. In this hush, before the world has truly stirred from its slumber, there is one sound that begins, not as an intrusion, but as a natural part of the morning's awakening. It is the sound of a bellows breathing. A deep, rhythmic sigh, followed by the gentle rustle of air feeding a hunger deep within the heart of the smithy. This is where our story begins, not with a clangor of steel, but with a breath. It is a breath of intention, the first note in a symphony of creation that will echo through the ages. This is the world of the medieval blacksmith, an artist of fire and iron, a quiet alchemist whose work would shape the destiny of kingdoms. Imagine stepping into that space. The air is still cool from the night, but it carries the ancient scent of coal, of old smoke ingrained into the very timber of the roof beams, and the sharp metallic tang of iron. It is a smell of work, of purpose, of transformation. In the center of it all stands the forge, a stone altar to potential. The smith moves with a quiet economy, his motions practiced and smooth, a ritual performed 1,000 times. He is not merely a laborer, he is a conductor, and his orchestra is the elemental forces of earth and air, fire and water. His first task is to wake the fire, to coax embers from the banked ashes of yesterday's labor. He adds fresh charcoal, a black and porous earth, and with the steady, patient push and pull of the bellows, he gives it life. The air whispers, and deep within the mound of black, a single point of orange appears, then another, until they coalesce into a heart of glowing, vibrant heat. This is the womb from which all things will be born. The raw material of his craft is iron, but not the pure, refined metal we know today. This is bloomery iron, won from the earth through immense effort. It arrives at his smithy as a rough, spongy lump called a bloom, still riddled with the rocky impurities of its origin, the slag. It is earthy, crude, and unremarkable to look at. It holds its potential locked away, a secret waiting for the key of fire. The smith selects a piece of this iron, hefting its rough weight in his hand, judging it not for what it is, but for what it could become. This relationship between the smith and his material is one of deep understanding, a conversation that will last for hours. He is not forcing his will upon an inert object. He is collaborating with it, guiding it, persuading it to reveal its true nature. He places the lump of iron deep into the heart of the fire, nestling it amongst the coals. The bellows work again, and the heat intensifies, wrapping the metal in a fierce, loving embrace. The smith watches, his eyes reading the colors of the fire like a scholar reads a text. He sees the subtle shifts from dull red to bright cherry, to a brilliant, almost blinding orange yellow, and finally to that incandescent white heat that signifies the iron is ready to be worked. It is not yet melting. That would be a failure, a loss of the material's integrity. Instead, it is becoming plastic, malleable, its internal structure softening, becoming willing to be shaped. It is a state of perfect readiness, a moment of pure potential. With a pair of long tongs, he draws the glowing mass from the fire. It pulses with an inner light, a small star captured from the heavens and brought to earth. He transfers it to the anvil, a massive block of steel that is the steadfast companion to the fire's passion. The anvil is the foundation, the unyielding truth upon which all forms are realized. In his other hand, he takes up his hammer. This is not a crude bludgeon. It is an extension of his own arm, perfectly balanced, its weight and shape designed for control and precision. The first strike is a meeting of wills. The ring of hammer on hot iron is a sound that defines an era. It is a clear, sharp note that cuts through the morning air, a declaration that creation has begun. But this first shaping is not about forming a point or an edge. It is about purification. The hammer blows fall in a rhythmic pattern, each strike carefully placed. With every impact, the impurities, the brittle slag trapped within the iron, are forced out. They spark and fly from the metal like tiny angry stars, expelled by the relentless persuasion of the hammer. The smith heats the iron again and again, returning it to the fire to soften, then back to the anvil to be worked. Each cycle, known as a heat, drives out more of the weakness, compacts the metal, and begins to draw it out into a longer, more usable bar. This is the process of drawing out, of making the material longer and thinner, the first step towards any tool or weapon. It is a meditation in repetition, a physical prayer of purification. The smith's world narrows to this cycle. The roar of the fire, the glow of the metal, the ring of the hammer, the hiss of escaping impurities. He is not just making metal, he is making it better. He is turning a flawed piece of the earth into something strong, something reliable. For a weapon, especially a sword, simple iron is not enough. Iron can be strong, but it is also soft. A blade made only of iron would bend and dull quickly in the chaos of battle. The smith's genius lay in his understanding of this limitation and his knowledge of how to overcome it. The answer was steel. Steel is iron that has been combined with a small, precise amount of carbon. This alchemical marriage transforms the metal, making it harder, able to hold a devastatingly sharp edge. The medieval smith didn't have laboratories or precise chemical measurements. His knowledge was empirical, passed down through generations, learned in the heat and sweat of the forge. One of the primary methods for creating steel was through a process called carburization. The smith would take his purified iron bar and pack it in a clay container surrounded by charcoal. This would be sealed and placed in a very hot fire for many hours, sometimes for an entire day. During this time, carbon atoms from the charcoal would slowly diffuse into the surface of the iron, transforming the outer layers into steel. It was a slow, patient magic, a silent transformation happening within the sealed clay womb. The result was a piece of metal that was steel on the outside but still softer iron on the inside, a perfect combination for a blade that needed a hard, sharp edge but a resilient, flexible core that wouldn't snap under impact. Another, more advanced technique was pattern welding, a method that speaks to the blacksmith's role as a true artist. The smith would take rods of iron and rods of carburized steel. He would twist them together while they were white-hot, forging them into a single, inseparable billet. This billet would then be drawn out and folded, again and again, sometimes hundreds of times. Each fold welded the layers together, creating a composite material of incredible strength and complexity. When such a blade was finally polished and etched with a mild acid, the different metals would react differently, revealing a breathtaking pattern on its surface, swirling lines like wood grain, or flowing patterns reminiscent of water or mist. These were the famous Frankish and Viking pattern, welded swords, often called Damascus blades in their time, weapons of legend that were as beautiful as they were deadly. Each one was a unique fingerprint of the fire and the hand that made it. Once the smith had his chosen material, his purified iron, his carburized steel, or his beautifully layered composite billet, the true act of creation could begin. For a sword, the most revered of weapons, the process was a sacred geometry. The smith would begin by drawing out the steel into a long, flat bar. This was the blank slate, the precursor to the blade. Using careful hammer blows, he would begin to shape the profile. The hammer was his pencil, the anvil his page. He would draw out the point, tapering the end with precise angled strikes. He would define the edges, working the metal thinner there, while leaving the center ridge, the fuller, thicker for strength and to lighten the blade. The fuller was not a blood groove, as myth sometimes suggests. It was a brilliant piece of engineering, a spine that gave the blade stiffness without the weight of a thicker slab of metal. Every step was a conversation between the material and the maker. The metal would tell him when it was growing cold and brittle, needing the rejuvenating embrace of the fire. The smith would listen, his eyes and experience reading the fading glow of the heat. He would reheat the blade again and again, each time working on a different section, slowly bringing the entire form into harmony. It was a dance of heat and force, a slow, deliberate coaxing of form from formlessness. The shape that emerged was not arbitrary. It was the product of centuries of evolution. A broad, heavy blade for cleaving through mail and bone. A longer, tapered blade for the swift, piercing thrust of a knightly estoc. A curved saber for the slashing cavalry charge. Each design was a response to the needs of the battlefield, a solution forged in fire. The hammer was not the only tool of persuasion. The smith used a variety of specialized tools to refine the shape. He might use a flatter. The clang of iron echoed through the mist-shrouded valleys, a metallic chorus heralding the dawn of what would become one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the gloom, they illuminated not just the dew-kissed grass of the French countryside, but the glinting helms and raised standards of two mighty kingdoms poised for war. This was not merely a battle. It was the culmination of generations of simmering resentment, tangled bloodlines, and the relentless pursuit of power that would come to define the brutal century-long struggle we now call the 100 Years' War. The air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation, heavy with the scent of damp wool, oiled leather, and the faint coppery promise of blood. On the English side, men-at-arms checked the tension on their longbows, the unique yew-wood creaking a soft, deadly rhythm. These were not the noble knights of song and story, but often common yeomen, their arms thick with muscle earned from a lifetime of drawing this formidable weapon. Each man carried a sheaf of arrows, their goose feather fletching neatly aligned, their iron tips sharp enough to punch through mail and into the flesh beneath. They stood in silent ranks, a forest of staves pointing skyward, their faces set in grim masks of determination. They knew the stories from Crécy and Poitiers, victories carved into the national psyche, where the hail of English arrows had turned charging French cavalry into a chaotic, dying mess. They prayed for a repeat of that history today. Opposing them, across the field that would soon be churned into a morass of mud and suffering, the French host presented a dazzling, almost blinding spectacle. It was a pageant of medieval chivalry in its full, glorious arrogance. The morning light flashed on polished plate armor, on shields emblazoned with intricate heraldry, golden lilies on fields of azure, crimson lions rampant, checkered patterns of black and white, knights atop massive destriers, beasts bred for war and armored in steel chamfrons and crinets, snorted plumes of vapor into the chill air, their hooves stamping impatiently. The nobility of France was here in its entirety, a brotherhood of the sword bound by honor, pride, and an unshakable belief in the supremacy of the mounted, armored knight. They looked upon the English lines with contempt, seeing not an army, but a rabble to be swept aside in a single glorious charge. The lessons of previous defeats were buried under layers of aristocratic hubris. Between these two armies stood King Henry V himself. At 28, he was a veteran of war and politics, his youthful features already hardened by the realities of rule. He rode slowly before his lines, his armor of functional, well-worn steel, lacking the frivolous ornamentation of his French counterparts. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned his troops, meeting the gaze of archers and knights alike. He did not need to shout. His presence was a tonic. He was the son of a usurper, his own claim to the English throne, and through his great-grandfather, Edward III, to the French crown itself, constantly questioned. This campaign in France was as much about securing his dynasty at home as it was about claiming lands abroad. A victory here would silence all his critics, unite his kingdom, and perhaps, just perhaps, force the French to the negotiating table on his terms. He raised his hand, and a silence, profound and total, fell over the English army. The only sound was the gentle flutter of the banners overhead, the silk and canvas snapping in the breeze. The French commanders, meanwhile, were embroiled in the petty squabbles that so often plagued their forces. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, a practical and experienced soldier, argued for caution. He urged them to wait, to let the English starve or make a desperate move across the sodden ground. But his voice was drowned out by the younger, hotter-blooded nobles. Men like the Marshal Boucicaut and the Dukes of Orleans and Bourbon, their honors stung by Henry's audacious march through their territory, clamored for immediate attack. They were eager for glory, each wanting to be the one to personally capture the English king and win everlasting renown. The command structure, fragmented by rivalry and pride, tilted decisively toward the reckless charge. Trumpets blared, a brilliant, defiant sound that sliced through the morning air. The order was given. The chivalry of France began to move. It started as a walk, a slow, deliberate advance of thousands of tons of steel, horseflesh, and human will. The ground, freshly plowed and soaked by the previous night's rain, immediately began to grip at the horses' hooves. The walk became a trudging, labored pace. Then, as the distance closed, the trumpet sounded again, and the cry went up, Montjoie Saint-Denis. The charge began. Or rather, it attempted to begin. The magnificent destriers, their powerful muscles straining, found themselves sinking into the clinging mud. The charge, intended to be a thunderous, earth-shattering avalanche, quickly degenerated into a slow, exhausting, and disorganized slog. The weight of the full plate armor, on both men and horses, became a crippling liability. The French knights were being slowed to a virtual standstill in the exact killing zone Henry had chosen for them. This was the moment the English longbowmen had been waiting for. They had planted their sharpened stakes in the ground before them, a simple yet effective defense against cavalry, and now they stepped forward. Without a shouted command, but with a unified, practiced motion born of years of training, they knocked their arrows. 6 feet of yew wood bent into a deep arc, the hemp strings groaning under immense pressure. Then came the sound that would haunt French nightmares for generations. Not a single twang, but a great rushing sigh like a monstrous wind, as thousands of arrows were loosed at once. The sky blackened. The sun was blotted out by a soaring, whispering cloud of projectiles that reached its apex and then fell, with deadly inevitability, upon the struggling French vanguard. The effect was catastrophic. The arrows did not merely bounce off the polished plate armor as the knights had arrogantly assumed. They struck with the force of a modern bullet. At this range, the bodkin point arrows, designed specifically to penetrate armor, punched through steel plate, through mail, and into the bodies within. Horses screamed, pierced through their bards and plunging to the ground, throwing their riders heavily into the mud. Knights crumpled, arrows sprouting from shoulders, thighs, and the vulnerable joints of their armor. The glorious charge disintegrated into a chaotic, screaming shambles. Men and animals lay writhing in the mud, the field becoming a treacherous obstacle course of the dead and dying for those still trying to press forward. The English archers, now a relentless machine of death, continued their work. They shot not in volleys on command, but at their own rapid pace, each man firing 10, 12, even 15 arrows a minute. The air was filled with their hissing song. The French rear ranks, pushing forward, could scarcely believe the scene before them. Their glorious van was being systematically annihilated without ever having reached the enemy line. The mud was churned crimson, the air thick with the screams of the wounded, the panicked whinnies of horses, and the relentless thud of arrows finding their marks. Yet, such was their numbers and their courage that some of the French men-at-arms, on foot now, their horses lost, finally managed to struggle through the arrow storm and the morass to reach the English line. Here the battle descended into a brutal, intimate struggle. The English men-at-arms, dismounted as per Henry's orders, met them with a solid wall of shields and poleaxes. The battlefield narrowed to a desperate scrum of heaving, grunting men, the air filled with the deafening crash of steel on steel, the splintering of wood, and the guttural cries of combat. Poleaxes, with their wicked combination of axe blade, hammer, and spike, rose and fell with grim efficiency, crushing helmets and shearing through armor. Daggers sought the gaps in armor at close quarters. It was a test of sheer endurance and brutality. Henry V fought in the midst of this melee, his personal guard forming a protective knot around him. He was no distant commander, he was a king proving his valor in the most direct way possible. His axe was a blur, and his presence inspired his men to superhuman efforts. For a terrifying moment, the press was so great that he was driven to his knees, and a French knight managed to strike a blow that shattered the crown-shaped ornament on his helmet, a near miss that would have ended the war and changed history. But his bodyguards closed around him, and he surged back to his feet, fighting with renewed ferocity. The battle raged for hours, a timeless period of exhaustion and horror. The initial French assault had been broken, but fresh waves continued to arrive, feeding the meat grinder. The English line, though holding, was stretched to its absolute limit. Men fought with the strength of desperation, knowing that defeat meant certain death or lifelong captivity. The piles of bodies grew so high that they became barriers themselves, and men clambered over the corpses of friends and foes alike to continue the fight. It was at this critical juncture, with the English army's energy beginning to flag, that a moment of pure panic almost undid them. A cry went up from the rear, "There!" The clang of steel on steel echoed across the valley, a brutal symphony that spoke of men's ambitions and the terrible price of power. As the Norman cavalry, a thunderous wave of mail and horseflesh, crashed upon the thinning English shield wall, the fate of a kingdom hung in the balance. This was not merely a battle, it was a cataclysm, a seismic event that would fracture the old world of the Anglo-Saxons and forge, in fire and blood, a new England. The air, thick with the coppery scent of blood and the sour tang of fear, was rent by the screams of the dying and the guttural war cries of the living. King Harold Godwinson, his eye a ruined, bloody socket from the relentless hail of Norman arrows, fought on with a desperate, grim fury. He knew, as every thane and housecarl around him knew, that the high ground of Senlac Ridge was their only advantage, the interlocking wall of their shields, their only hope against the armored knights of Duke William. Yet the Norman Duke was a master of warfare, a patient and cunning predator. His initial cavalry charges, though bloody and repulsed with terrible losses, were not mere brutish assaults. They were probes, tests of the English resolve. And in that resolve, he saw a potential weakness, a fierce, proud bravery that could be twisted into a fatal mistake. He gave a new order. The cry went out, and on the left flank, a contingent of Breton knights, their charge broken by the staunch English defense, seemed to waver. It was a feint, a masterpiece of staged panic. They turned their horses, not in an orderly retreat, but in a seemingly chaotic rout, crying out in apparent terror, streaming back down the slope they had so recently charged up. A great roar went up from the English right flank, primarily made up of the less disciplined fired, the peasant levy. They saw not a tactical retreat, but a victory. They saw their enemy broken and fleeing. The temptation was too great. For hours they had stood, a static wall, enduring the terrifying spectacle of armored destriers and the deadly rain of arrows. Now the enemy was running. With a triumphant yell, they broke ranks. They abandoned the safety of the shield wall, streaming down the ridge in a ragged, furious mob, intent on cutting down the fleeing Bretons. They believed the day was won. It was their doom. From his position, Duke William, his helmet cast aside to be better seen by his men, saw the English line rupture. He saw the fatal gap open. He raised his sword high, and the order was given. The main body of Norman knights, held in reserve, now spurred their mighty warhorses forward. They did not charge the still solid center, where Harold's housecarls stood firm. They wheeled, a single terrible organism of purpose, and slammed into the exposed flank of the pursuing English fyrd. It was a slaughter. The peasants, armed with spears and axes, their only armor perhaps a leather jerkin, were cut down like wheat before the scythe. The Norman knights, their long swords rising and falling with a mechanical horror, carved through them. The disciplined retreat of the Bretons turned in an instant. They rallied and joined the massacre. The slope became a charnel house, choked with the bodies of the English fyrd. The center of the English line was now perilously weakened, its right flank hanging open and vulnerable. The Norman archers, their quivers nearly spent, were ordered to shoot again, this time aiming high to drop their arrows directly into the heart of the English position. It was during this renewed barrage, a dark cloud that blotted out the October sun, that the fate of the king was sealed. The legends would later speak of the arrow, a single fateful projectile that found its mark. Whether it was indeed an arrow or the sword of a knight who finally breached the inner circle of housecarls matters little. Harold Godwinson, the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king of England, fell. The news spread through the English ranks not as a shout, but as a cold, silent dread. The heart of their resistance was gone. The dragon standard of Wessex, the proud symbol of their kings, wavered and then fell, disappearing into the bloody morass. What followed was not a retreat but a rout. The housecarls, their oath to their king fulfilled unto death, fought on around his body until the last man was slain. But for the rest, the will to fight evaporated. The Norman knights, sensing the final victory, pursued with a relentless savage joy. The slaughter continued long after the battle was decided, as the English were chased through the darkening woods and fields later known fittingly as the Malfoss, or Evil Ditch, where many more met their end. As dusk settled over the field of Hastings, a terrible silence began to descend, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the calls of the carrion birds already gathering. Duke William of Normandy had his victory. The crown he had coveted was now his, though it rested on a mountain of the dead. The victory at Hastings, however, was not the end of the conquest. It was merely the dramatic, bloody prelude. William, now styled the Conqueror, understood that to claim a kingdom was one thing, but to hold it was another matter entirely. The English aristocracy had been decapitated, quite literally in many cases, but the country was vast, proud, and resistant. He moved with methodical and brutal efficiency. His first objective was to secure his strategic position. He did not immediately march on London. Instead, he began a campaign of psychological terror, a deliberate policy of devastation known as the harrying of the South. His forces fanned out, burning villages, destroying crops, and slaughtering livestock in a wide arc around the capital. He wanted to demonstrate the price of further resistance, to show the English that he was not merely a claimant to the throne, but an irresistible force of nature. The message was received. In December of 1066, even as the surviving English earls and bishops debated raising Edgar the Atheling, the young last male heir of the ancient royal house of Wessex, to the throne, the reality of their situation became unbearable. The land was burning. William's army, reinforced with fresh troops from the continent, was a specter of destruction at their gates. A delegation of leading English nobles, their spirit broken, came to William at Berkhamsted. They offered him the crown. It was a submission born not of loyalty, but of sheer exhausted necessity. On Christmas Day, 1066, in a moment of profound historical irony, William the Conqueror was crowned King of England, in Edward the Confessor's Great Minster at Westminster. The ceremony, intended to be a sacred affirmation of divine sanction, nearly turned into a bloody riot. The Norman guards stationed outside the church, hearing the loud acclamations from inside in a language they did not understand, mistook the shouts of the English crowd for the beginnings of an uprising. In a panic, they began setting fire to the surrounding buildings. Smoke drifted into the cathedral itself, and the congregation, nobles and commoners alike, fled in terror, leaving the trembling Archbishop of York and the new king to hurriedly complete the rite. It was an ominous portent, a symbol of the fear, misunderstanding, and violence that would characterize the next 2 decades. William spent the next several years systematically crushing any flicker of rebellion and consolidating his power. He returned to Normandy in 1067, leaving his half-brother Odo, Bishop of Bayeux, and his trusted lieutenant, William Fitz-Osbern, to govern. Their heavy-handed rule immediately sparked resistance. In the southwest, Thens, who had submitted, now rose again, allied with the city of Exeter. William returned with terrifying speed, laid a brutal siege to Exeter, and forced its surrender, building a royal castle within its walls to ensure its future compliance, a tactic he would repeat across the land. The most serious threats came from the north, a region that had always been semi-independent and fiercely resistant to southern rule. In 1069, a great rebellion erupted, supported by an invasion from King Svein Estrithson of Denmark, who saw an opportunity to reclaim the North Sea Empire of his uncle Canute. The Norman Earl Robert de Comyn was slaughtered along with his men in Durham, and the rebels, joined by Edgar the Atheling and other high-born exiles, swept south, capturing York and destroying the Norman garrison there. William's response was to be his most infamous act, an atrocity so complete it would scar the collective memory of the North for generations. He marched north in the winter of 1069 to 1070, a season when armies were not supposed to campaign. He did not merely seek to defeat the rebel army, he sought to annihilate the very possibility of rebellion. This was the harrying of the North. His forces fanned out across Yorkshire and beyond, in a calculated campaign of total destruction. Villages were burned to the ground. Stores of grain and food were destroyed. Livestock were slaughtered. The population was put to the sword or driven out to starve. Contemporary chroniclers, both Norman and English, wrote of 100,000 deaths, of entire landscapes left depopulated and silent, of survivors reduced to cannibalism or selling themselves into slavery just to get food. The Domesday Book, compiled years later, would still record vast swaths of Yorkshire as waste, a chilling bureaucratic testament to the thoroughness of William's vengeance. The Danes were bought off with a large Danegeld and allowed to leave. The rebellion. The clatter of hooves on cobblestones echoed through the narrow streets as the knight's destrier rounded the corner, its breath pluming in the chill morning air like a dragon's. The year was 1215, and the very fabric of power was being rewoven in a water meadow called Runnymede. King John, a man whose very name had become a byword for capricious cruelty, sat stiffly in his tent, the parchment before him seeming to pulse with a life of its own. It was not merely a document, it was a cage, its bars forged from the collective will of his most powerful barons. The wax seal he would press into it would not signify agreement, but surrender. Outside, the murmur of armored men, the scent of damp earth and cold steel, the palpable tension of a nation holding its breath. This was the moment the Magna Carta was born. It was a promise scratched in ink that no man, not even a king, was above the law. A fragile promise, to be sure, one John would tear to shreds the moment the barons' armies dispersed. But a seed had been planted in the fertile soil of discontent. Its roots would snake through the centuries, deep and tenacious, shaping constitutions and inspiring revolutions in lands not yet discovered. This struggle between the crown and those who would check its power was the central drama of the High Middle Ages, a slow, grinding dance towards a new balance. The feudal pyramid, once a rigid hierarchy with the king at its apex, was beginning to show cracks as the merchant classes in burgeoning towns grew wealthy and restless, their loyalty bought not with land, but with charters of their own, granting them freedoms from the arbitrary tolls and taxes of local lords. In the great trading hubs of the Hanseatic League, from London to Novgorod, the air was thick with the smells of salt, hemp, and ambition. The clink of silver coin began to compete with the clank of knightly armor. A new world was being born in the crowded, filthy, vibrant womb of the medieval city. A world of guilds and burghers, of literacy and accounting ledgers, a world where a man's worth was increasingly measured not by the blood in his veins, but by the coin in his purse. And while merchants calculated profits, Another kind of seeker was looking heavenward. The great age of cathedral building was reaching its zenith, a breathtaking outburst of faith and engineering that scarred the skyline of Europe with stone and glass. To stand at the base of the nearly complete Chartres Cathedral was to feel oneself shrink into insignificance. Its soaring spires seemed to pierce the very vault of heaven, a stone prayer aimed at God. Within, the air was cool and smelled of old incense and cold stone. But when the sun reached its zenith, it ignited the stained glass, transforming the interior into a kaleidoscope of divine light, deep sapphire blues, ruby reds, and emerald greens telling the stories of saints and scripture to a largely illiterate populace. The labor was immense, the cost astronomical, the duration spanning generations. Master masons, their faces powdered with fine stone dust, directed armies of craftsmen, carvers who gave life to grotesque gargoyles and beatific saints, glassmakers who trapped light and narrative in their brilliant panels, blacksmiths whose iron braces held the tons of stone in a delicate equilibrium. This was not merely construction, it was a communal act of devotion, a testament to a belief that the material world could be shaped into a gateway to the transcendent. Yet, for all this spiritual striving, the medieval world was never far from violence. The borders of Christendom were perpetually contested ground. In the sun-baked hills of Iberia, the Reconquista was a slow, bloody tide of advance and retreat between the Christian kingdoms of the north and the Muslim taifas of Al-Andalus. The clash of cultures was not always one of simple hostility. It was also a fertile exchange. In cities like Toledo, after its capture by Alfonso VI of Castile in 1085, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars worked side by side in translating ancient Greek and Arabic texts of philosophy, medicine, and astronomy, knowledge that had been lost to the Latin West for centuries. This flow of ideas would soon fuel the intellectual revolution of the universities. But on the battlefield, it was a simpler, crueler arithmetic. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 saw a combined Christian force crush the Almohad Caliphate, a victory so decisive it broke the back of Muslim power in Spain and opened the heart of Andalusia to conquest. The field after the battle was a horrific tableau, the air thick with the cries of the wounded and the carrion birds circling overhead, the ground churned to mud by hooves and boots and soaked with blood, the glitter of broken weapons amidst the countless still forms. Further east, a storm of an entirely different nature was gathering on the vast steppes of Central Asia. A Mongol chieftain named Temujin had united the fractious tribes under his banner and taken a new title, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. His rise was meteoric, his methods utterly ruthless. The Mongol way of war was one of unparalleled speed, discipline, and terror. Their horse archers could loose volleys of arrows with deadly accuracy from full gallop, maneuvering with a cohesion that sedentary European armies could scarcely comprehend. They were masters of psychological warfare, employing calculated cruelty to sap the will of their enemies before a siege even began. The rumble of their approaching hordes was like thunder on the horizon, a sound that heralded the end of worlds. In 1223, this unknown terror first touched Europe at the Battle of the Kalka River, where a combined force of Rus princes and Cuman nomads was utterly annihilated by the Mongol generals Jebe and Subutai. The victorious commanders celebrated by holding a great feast on the wooden platform they had constructed over the captured Russian nobles, slowly crushing them to death beneath the boards as they ate and drank. It was a message, written in blood and agony, that a new and terrible power had arrived. This tension was not unique to England. Across the Channel, in France, the cunning and determined King Philip II, Augustus had spent his reign methodically dismantling the Angevin Empire of the Plantagenets, seizing vast swaths of territory from the hapless John. By his death in 1223, he had transformed France from a weak feudal monarchy into the most powerful state in Europe. His grandson, Louis IX, would later embody the medieval ideal of the Crusader king. So pious, just, and devout he would be canonized as Saint Louis. Yet even his saintly reputation was forged in the crucible of failure. His 2 crusades to Egypt and Tunis would end in military disaster and his own death from disease. But his domestic rule, guided by a profound sense of Christian justice, became legendary. He would often sit beneath an oak tree in the Vincennes forest to personally hear the petitions of his humblest subjects, rendering judgments that were celebrated for their fairness. This image of the just king, accessible to his people, became a powerful archetype, a counterpoint to the tyrannical model of a John. The 13th century was also the great age of the scholastics, where faith sought understanding through the rigorous application of reason. The universities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford were now thriving international centers of learning, drawing eager minds from across Christendom. In cold, cramped lecture halls, students huddled on straw-strewn floors, their breath misting in the air as they listened to masters explicate the texts of Aristotle, recently recovered through Arabic translators, and now threatening to overturn centuries of Christian thought with their powerful, logic-based view of the natural world. The intellectual crisis this caused was profound. How could pagan philosophy be reconciled with revealed truth? The answer came from a quiet, portly Dominican friar from Italy, teaching at the University of Paris. Thomas Aquinas undertook a monumental synthesis, his Summa Theologica aiming to weave together Aristotelian logic and Christian doctrine into a seamless whole, proving that faith and reason were not enemies but two paths leading to the same divine truth. His work would become the bedrock of Catholic theology for centuries. The clatter of hooves on cobblestone echoed through the narrow streets of York, a percussive rhythm that spoke of urgency and importance. Messengers bearing the royal seal pushed their mounts through throngs of merchants and townsfolk, their faces set in grim determination as they carried dispatches that would alter the course of kingdoms. In the year 1296, such sights had become commonplace across England, as King Edward I, known to history as Longshanks for his imposing stature, marshaled his forces for what would become one of the most consequential campaigns of his reign. The air crackled with tension, a palpable energy that seemed to seep from the very stones of the castles and cathedrals that dotted the landscape, as England prepared to turn its gaze northward, toward the wild and restive kingdom of Scotland. Edward's ambition was a forge that heated the political landscape of Britain to a white-hot intensity. His vision was nothing less than the complete subjugation of Scotland, the bending of its proud nobility to his will, and the incorporation of its ancient territories into a unified realm under the English crown. This was not merely a matter of territorial expansion, it was a personal crusade, born of a deep-seated belief in his own sovereign rights and a burning desire to avenge what he perceived as Scottish treachery. The death of the young Margaret, Maid of Norway, in 1290, had left a vacuum of power, a yawning chasm of succession that had drawn Edward into Scottish affairs as an arbitrator, only for him to emerge claiming feudal superiority over the northern kingdom. The Scots naturally saw matters differently. Their nation, though often fractured by internal rivalries, possessed a fierce and independent spirit that would not easily bow to foreign dominion. The stage was set for conflict not in some open field, but in the intricate web of alliances, oaths, and betrayals that characterized medieval politics. Edward, a master of legalistic warfare as much as military strategy, had meticulously constructed a case for his overlordship. He demanded that the Scottish magnates, including the formidable Robert Bruce and the powerful John Comyn, recognize him as their feudal lord. Many, under immense pressure and facing the prospect of devastating invasion, reluctantly gave their assent. Their seals were affixed to documents that would later be brandished as evidence of their submission, though the ink often felt like chains upon their souls. This paper conquest, however, was fragile. The spirit of resistance, though suppressed, was not extinguished. It smoldered in the hearts of men like William Wallace, a knight of Elderslie, whose name was not yet known in the courts of kings, but would soon be whispered with a mixture of fear and awe across the land. The first true explosion of violence was not a grand battle, but a sudden, brutal act of defiance in the small town of Lanark. The sheriff, William Heselrigg, represented the long arm of English law, and his rule was harsh and unforgiving. The story, passed down through ballads and chronicles, tells of Wallace's wife, Marion Braidfute, being murdered by Heselrigg, a personal tragedy that ignited a public firestorm. Whether strictly true in its details or not, the narrative encapsulates the raw, personal nature of the conflict. It was not an abstract war over feudal rights, but a struggle against the daily humiliations and brutalities of occupation. Wallace, consumed by a grief that fused with a righteous fury, descended upon Lanark with a band of loyal followers. They stormed the sheriff's residence, cut down Heselrig and his guards, and set the town ablaze. This was not the calculated move of a statesman. It was the visceral reaction of a man pushed beyond endurance, and it served as a catalyst, a spark that leaped across the dry tinder of Scottish discontent. News of the Lanark raid spread with the swiftness of a summer wildfire fanned by a strong wind. It was a story that fed the soul of oppressed people. Here was a man not of high nobility, but of the knightly class, who had taken up the sword and shown that the English sheriffs and their men-at-arms were not invincible. Men from the hills and glens, from the fishing villages and farming hamlets, began to flock to Wallace's side. They were armed with whatever they could find: axes used for splitting wood, sharpened scythes, hunting spears, and a burning desire to reclaim their dignity. Wallace proved to be a natural leader, charismatic and fiercely determined, possessing a military acumen that belied his modest station. He understood the terrain and the strengths of his fledgling army. He would not meet the English chivalry in an open contest of heavy cavalry and disciplined formations. That would be suicide. Instead, he mastered the art of the ambush, the rapid strike, and the swift retreat into the trackless wilderness that the English could not navigate. Meanwhile, in London, Edward received the reports from the north with a cold and mounting anger. The rebellion of a minor landowner was an irritant, but a dangerous one. It could not be tolerated. He dispatched a substantial force under the command of John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey, a seasoned and respected commander, to crush this insolent uprising and reinforce English authority. Surrey's army was a professional, well-equipped host. Hundreds of mounted knights clad in chainmail and the emerging plate armor, their colorful surcoats displaying their heraldry. Longbowmen from the Welsh marches, whose skill with the yew-bow was already legendary, and thousands of disciplined infantry. It was a hammer designed to smash any resistance. They marched north with confidence, expecting to scatter the rabble before them. Wallace and his co-commander, Sir Andrew Moray, another nobleman who had thrown his lot in with the rebellion, were waiting for them. They had chosen their ground with brilliant care, the Stirling Bridge. This was a strategic choke point. The River Forth, wide and treacherous with currents, looped around the base of the Abbey Craig, and the only crossing for miles was a narrow wooden bridge, wide enough for perhaps 2 horsemen to ride abreast. The English army, vast and cumbersome, would be forced to funnel itself across this bottleneck. It was a perfect trap. On the morning of September 11, 1297, the English vanguard began its crossing. From their position on the high ground of the Abbey Craig, Wallace, Moray, and their captains watched. The Scottish army was a stark contrast to the glittering host below. They were foot soldiers, mostly spearmen formed into deep skeltrons, dense defensive circles of pikemen that could prove impervious to cavalry charges. They were hungry, poorly armored, but fighting on their own soil for a cause they believed in with every fiber of their being. The tension was immense. The musty smell of damp wool and leather mingled with the metallic scent of fear. Men gripped their long, sharpened spears, the fearsome Scottish pikes, until their knuckles were white, muttering prayers and glancing at the calm, resolute face of their leader. The English commanders, underestimating the Scots utterly, believed they were facing a disorganized mob that would break at the first sight of a cavalry charge. They continued to push men across the bridge, a fatal error. The Scottish leadership waited with the patience of predators. They let a significant portion of the English force cross, enough to be a serious threat, but not so many that they couldn't be overwhelmed before the main body still on the far bank could reinforce them. The moment was a razor's edge. Too soon and the trap would fail. Too late, and their own line would be shattered. Then the signal came. A single horn blast, sharp and clear, cut through the damp morning air. It was the sound of destiny. With a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hills, the Scottish skeltrons advanced. They did not charge wildly, but moved with a grim, disciplined purpose, their forest of pikes leveling toward the English knights who were still struggling to deploy on the boggy, confined ground north of the river. The English cavalry, the pride of their army, found their charge impossible. The ground was against them, their momentum was nil, and the wall of spear points was utterly impenetrable. Horses, maddened with pain and fear, reared and threw their riders, creating chaos in the ranks. The Scottish spearmen pressed their advantage, driving the disorganized English vanguard back toward the river in a relentless, crushing advance. Panic erupted on the bridge itself. English soldiers, seeing the horror unfolding ahead, tried to retreat back across the narrow span, while those on the south bank, under the command of a horrified Earl of Surrey, tried to push forward to aid their comrades. The result was a catastrophic traffic jam of terrified men and horses on the unstable wooden structure. The air filled with the screams of dying men and animals, the clash of steel, the splintering of wood. Then, under the immense strain and weight, the central supports of Stirling Bridge gave way with a groan that was drowned out by the cacophony of battle. A large section of the bridge collapsed, plunging hundreds of armored men into the cold, swift currents of the Forth. Most, weighed down by their mail, sank immediately and drowned. The battle turned into a slaughter. The English force that had crossed was isolated and systematically destroyed. The Scottish infantry, now unleashed from their defensive formations, swarmed over the survivors with axe, sword, and dagger. The Earl of Surrey, watching the disaster unfold from the safety of the southern bank, was utterly helpless. His professional army had been annihilated by a force he had considered beneath contempt. With what remained of his host, he turned and fled south, leaving behind the clatter of hooves on cobblestone echoed through the narrow streets of York, a percussive rhythm that spoke of urgency and purpose. This was no merchant's cart laden with wool or wine. This was the sound of a royal messenger, his cloak damp with the mist of the Northumbrian moors, his face set in a grim mask of duty. He carried not just a sealed parchment, but the very fate of a kingdom. The year was 1066, and the air across England was thick with a tension that could be tasted, a metallic fear that settled on the tongue. King Edward the Confessor, a man more devoted to prayer than to progeny, had died childless, leaving a vacuum of power that was already sucking the nation toward a vortex of steel and fire. In the smoky great hall of a thane's estate not far from the messenger's path, the news arrived as a low murmur, then a rising tide of anxious voices. Men who had just been laughing over roasted boar and ale now fell silent, their eyes darting toward their lord. Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, the most powerful man in England after the king himself, would not have been surprised. He had felt the shifting currents for months, perhaps years. The crown, a circlet of gold that weighed more than a millstone, was his for the taking. The Witan, the council of wise men, would surely choose him. He was strong, capable, a proven leader in war and peace. But he also knew that across the wind-whipped channel, two other pairs of eyes were fixed greedily upon that same crown. To the south, in the ducal palace of Rouen, William, Duke of Normandy, received his own intelligence with a cold, calculating stillness. He was a man forged in betrayal and hardened by a lifetime of conflict, his very legitimacy questioned from birth with the scornful label, William the Bastard. Yet he had carved his duchy into a formidable power through sheer, unrelenting will. He claimed, with a fervor that was both political and deeply personal, that Edward had promised him the throne years before, and that Harold himself had sworn a sacred oath over holy relics to uphold that promise. Harold's accession was not just an opportunity, it was a personal insult, a blasphemous breaking of a vow that demanded a righteous and terrible vengeance. William's mind, sharp as a Frankish dagger, began its work. This would not be a mere raid. It would be a crusade, blessed by the Pope himself, a holy war to punish a perjurer and claim what was rightfully his. The shipwrights of Normandy would soon be deafened by the sound of hammers as a vast fleet, not of Viking longships, but of deeper, broader transports, capable of carrying war horses, began to take shape.